Y'all, y'all, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Okay, so the men have plural marriages, and you're marrying your family members. I don't like my cousins like that. I don't like them like that. Then you got concubines and top tier wives and second tier wives and slave wives that are still slaves, even though they're wives with kids. Mm-mm, 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 mm-mm. You know, they did have to populate. Mm-mm, mm-mm, mm-mm. Welcome back to Wednesday Night Bible Class, everybody. I'm so glad that you were able to make it. So, tonight's class is going to be a little bit different. I'm kind of excited about it. Tonight, we're going to look at the economy of being an Israelite, an ancient Israelite. So, we're going to look at their houses, their housing structure, what all lived in the house with them. We're going to look at the family structure, family units. We're going to look at the marriage structure and how marriages took place. There were different ways that marriages took place. So we're going to look at that too. Let's go ahead and get right in it. There are two videos actually that I am going to combine into one, hopefully about 20, 25, 30-minute video for you guys so that it's not so long. So let's go ahead and get started.
In this lecture, we'll take a much closer look at these highland settlements. We'll explore an Israelite house and see how the Israelites would have raised crops, prepared food, and shared resources in order to survive in this land. We'll also look to the biblical text to get a sense for the ancient Israelite family and village structure. If you were to travel to one of the ancient villages in the Central Highlands, just west of the Jordan River, you would need to be in good shape. You would have to hike your way up the side of a series of steep, rocky hills. Parts of the hillside would be terraced, allowing for farming, so you could travel along the pathways back and forth up the stone terraces. Within the terraces, you might see olive trees and grapevines. You might also run into a young shepherd herding goats along the uncultivated parts of the hillside, where there's not much more than low scrub. Once at the village, you would see closely built clusters of mud brick homes. Each cluster of houses would share walls and open onto a shared courtyard. They have labeled this type of house the pillared house because almost every example of this type of house has a row of pillars. The pillared house becomes a dominant house type for all of Israelite history from 1200 BCE to the exile in the 6th century BCE. The house shape is rectangular or rectilinear,
What?
and the entrance was located at one.
Linear. Hmm. Okay, that's a word. Okay.
One of the narrow ends of the rectangle. And once in the house, you would be in a large pillared common area or broad room. This room and possibly an adjacent one would be used as the main activity area or workspace within the home. Now, if you or I were to enter one of these homes, our senses would likely be overwhelmed. First, the home would be relatively dark. Small windows might have allowed some natural light in, but this was a roofed brick home, so it would be dark. The only generated light would come from small oil lamps, fueled by olive oil and nestled within niches along the walls in the home. Your eyes would also be affected by smoke because many of these homes had small ovens fueled by wood and dried animal dung just inside the broad room. Even with some ventilation, there would still be smoke from tending this fire. So while your eyes adjusted to the darkness and the smoke, your nose would be accosted by a number of smells. I've already mentioned a dung-fueled stove. What I haven't mentioned is that on one or both sides of the common area, behind the pillars, there were animal stables housing oxen, donkeys, cattle, or sheep. The house itself was constructed of sun-baked mud brick that was then plastered over. And originally, archaeologists thought these homes were single-story homes with the main pillared room open to the sky. This would mean that people and livestock shared the same small living space. Then a few houses were found with the remains of staircases, and the thickness of the foundation walls suggests that they were capable of supporting a second story. So now even those houses that do not show staircases are thought to have been 2 stories. Wooden ladders were likely used in the absence of stairs. The discovery in several sites of plaster roof remains in the central common area suggested that this was not an open courtyard, and instead the house was fully roofed. The second story likely functioned as the main living area where sleeping, dining, and some work, like weaving, would have occurred. The artifact assemblage within an individual pillared house suggests a high level of cooperation and subsistence living, a lifestyle where men and women each made significant contributions to the survival of the family. The pottery that's commonly found in pillared houses is simple, utilitarian, and unadorned. It consists mostly of cooking pots and serving vessels and storage jars. The enormous amount of space devoted to large storage jars suggests that there were entire seasons when the family would have to live off what they had harvested and stored. The floor space of the entire back room was often taken up with these clay storage jars. It must have served as a kind of pantry. The presence of stables in the house points to the importance of animals and animal products like milk, wool, goat hair, and cow hides for the livelihood of the rural family. And the very common presence of loom weights for weaving indicates that families produced their own clothing and floor mats. Pillared houses are not found in isolation. Archaeologists call this grouping of pillared houses an extended family compound, meaning a senior couple might occupy one pillared house, and 2 adult sons and their wives would occupy additional dwellings, and all of the 3 houses would open onto a shared courtyard. There is strong evidence that these extended family compounds shared resources. In the shared courtyard, for example, we might find a single mud brick oven. This suggests that a family or cluster of homes would share baking facilities, and they would likely share the work of gathering wood to heat the oven. The courtyard might also have a single olive press, and in some clusters, especially in later periods, we find large water cisterns shared by several families. When we turn our attention to the biblical text, we find several stories that help us piece together what family was like, or what family life was like for the inhabitants of these highland villages. The first thing we can say in this regard is that family itself, especially a large family, was considered a tremendous blessing. Psalm 128 describes the life of a blessed man, a man who has revered the Lord and walked in his ways. It reads, "Happy is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. You shall eat the fruit of the labor of your own hands. You shall be happy, and it shall be well with you." Already we see the value for economic self-sufficiency. That which you produce, you will eat, and it will be enough. It continues, "Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your children will be like olive shoots around your table. So in addition to being able to produce his own food in adequate quantities, the blessed man is one whose wife dwells in his house and produces many children. What this psalm describes is an idealized vision of rural family life set in the highland villages we've just been exploring. A rural family is self-sufficient. They live off what they can produce with their own hands. The wife is likened to a vine and the children to olive shoots, both of which reflect two of the main crops produced in the highlands, grapes and olives. A crowd of children around one's table would be a blessing for a farming family that depends on the work of many hands. Finally, living to see a third generation on one's land would ensure the continuation of a man's house, name, and monument. There is no doubt that life in the central highland villages involved working with one's hands, and struggling to get the dry hillsides to produce crops. It is also clear that women would spend most of their adult lives pregnant or nursing children. A simple division of labor where men work the fields and women produce babies at home does not find support in other parts of the Bible or in the archaeological record. In Judges, chapters 17 and 18, we find an interesting description of a house and a family, the bite of a man named Micah. Now, this is not the same Micah found in the prophetic book by that name. The household of Micah consists of Micah, his mother, his son, and a salaried Levite priest. It also contains a shrine with a graven and molten image. The description of Micah's house indicates that it was actually made up of several buildings, also called houses, meaning Micah's household complex was likely something akin to the shared family compound that has been found archaeologically in the highland villages. The house or bite of Micah, it turns out, is a cluster of dwellings. There is Micah's own dwelling, a dwelling for his hired Levite, and a dwelling for the family shrine. Let's return to the gendered division of labor. The archaeological record, together with the written and iconographic sources, do support a gendered division of labor, but it in no way limits a woman's economic value to reproduction. In general, the Bible does associate men's work with farming and herding of animals. Let's think first about farming. While at certain times of year the entire family, including children, would be involved in the work of planting and harvesting, the Bible associates the production of raw materials for bread, weaving, and winemaking with men, and the processing of those materials with women. The book of Isaiah provides a fairly detailed picture of the process of farming, from planting to threshing. Does he who plows for sowing plow continually? Does he continually open and harrow his ground? When he has leveled its surface, does he not scatter dill, sow cumin, and put in wheat in rows, and barley in its proper place, and spelt as the border? For he is instructed aright. His God teaches him. Dill is not threshed with a threshing sledge, nor is a cartwheel rolled over cumin, but dill is beaten out with a stick, and cumin with a rod. A man would also need to tend the olive orchards and the vineyards. Olive oil was essential for everything, from making bread to lighting one's home to pouring out offerings before one's God. When we turn to women's work, baking, weaving, beer making, all of which were likely communal activities, are associated with women, and we can imagine several women from an extended family compound working together. Bread was a staple of the Israelite diet. The Bible consistently associates bread making with women. Part of the process involved grinding the grain. And for this, you would need millstones. Millstones are common household finds, and they are often found in the main common room at the entrance of the house. They consist of a concave base stone that was often made of basalt stone, and a smaller convex upper stone that would be pushed forward over the grain, removing the husk of the grain and grinding the seed into bread flour. The presence of several of these grinding stones in the broad room of a single pillared house suggests that it was a communal activity. Several women would work together to grind the necessary flour. Another activity that is consistently associated with women is weaving. And like bread making, this was an extremely time-consuming task. A person's garment or cloak was considered a valuable possession, often listed together with things like a man's cow or sheep or oxen. The reason for the high value of a cloak is that it took significant time and resources to produce. The Bible describes women weaving fine cloths for the wilderness tabernacle, and in one case, during the time of the monarchy, women are chastised for weaving cloths for the Canaanite goddess Asherah. Cloth production within a household for common use is an excellent example of both subsistence living and the cooperative nature of men's and women's work in the highland village. The wool or goat hair that was used to make threads came from the family's own livestock. Men would shear the sheep in the spring, and women and girls would wash the wool, spin it into thread using a spindle and whirl. Then the more senior, skilled women would weave the threads into clothing, sleeping mats, tents, and much more. All of these items would immediately be put to use in the household that produced them. Life in a highland village was based on a subsistence economy. You ate and wore what you produced with your own hands. Men's and women's work complemented one another. Both were essential for the self-sufficiency of the household and the village. While women would have spent the majority of their adult life pregnant and nursing children, their productive economic contribution to the house went well beyond childbearing. In our next lecture, we'll examine marriage patterns and social hierarchies within the Israelite household.
Let's jump right into the next one. There are 3 different ways that she's going to describe for people to enter into marriage in this next video. The third way we are not going to play because it can be and it is triggering. So we're not going to play that method. We're not going to discuss that method. I will leave the link for the Bible verses for that in the description box, and if you want to go check that out, please feel free. I mean, it's in the Bible, so, but we're not going to play it here because it is triggering. So
in our last lecture, we took a close-up look at the ancient Israelite home, the pillared house, and we learned how extended families cooperated with each other in order to farm in a difficult landscape. In today's lecture, I want to introduce some of the practices and beliefs that surrounded marriage in ancient Israel. I'll cover the types of marriages attested in the Bible and the social functions associated with marriage. My primary source for information will again be the book of Genesis. Even though the stories in Genesis are set during the time period before Israel became a nation, They were written much later, during the time when Israel existed as a monarchy. So the marriage practices that we find in the stories of Genesis likely reflect the ideals of Israel as a nation and a kingdom during the Iron Age.
Or they could reflect the ideals of them from the beginning to the monarchy. Like marriage ideas haven't changed that drastically over the years. So I don't see why it would have changed from the beginning to the monarchy. So I'm not sure if I think it's probably just that what they wrote about marriage in the beginning was what it was in the beginning. And if it changed later on, I'm sure they would have written about the change that happened later on.
I'll first discuss the weddings of Rebekah, Hagar, and Dinah in order to illustrate the various types of marriages and their social ramifications. Then I'll conclude with the funeral of Abraham in order to illustrate that when a male head of household died, the status differentiation between his wives and their respective children came to full expression. In other words, human societies have not evolved too much in the last 3 millennia. Let's start with the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah described in Genesis chapter 24. The ideal marriage was patrilocal, meaning the woman married out of her own family's home into her husband's household. It was also endogamous, meaning the husband and wife were from the same extended family or clan. The ideal marriage was negotiated between the families of the bride and the groom for their mutual long-term benefit. In Genesis 24, we learn that Abraham, Isaac's father, has become old and wants to see his son settled. So he arranges to send his household servant back to his homeland in Mesopotamia to acquire a wife for Isaac. Abraham is very concerned that his son not marry a local Canaanite woman. So he makes his servant swear not to allow Isaac to marry a woman from the daughters of the Canaanites, but instead to find a wife from Abraham's own kin. The servant travels to Haran, the city where Abraham had settled before moving to Canaan, and once there, he waits by the city well in the evening, when the text tells us that the women come to draw water. The ideal wife for Isaac appears immediately at the well, where the servant awaits her in prayer. So what makes her ideal? First, genealogy. The text identifies her as Abraham's grandniece. So a marriage with this woman fits the ideal criteria of endogamy. We then learn that Rebekah is beautiful and a virgin whom no man had known. So this is another required trait that the servant can check off his list. The servant now knows that he has found the ideal wife for Abraham's son Isaac. So he takes a gold ring and 2 bracelets and gives them to Rebekah. These gifts should be understood as the first in a series of bridal gifts that the servant will transfer to Rebekah and her family. Within Rebekah's mother's house, her brother Laban immediately emerges as the consummate host. He invites the servant into the house. He has a place prepared for the camels. He himself provides straw and feed for the camels and then brings water to wash the feet of Abraham's servant after the long journey. Finally, Laban prepares a feast for the servant in order to complete his extravagant display of hospitality. But before the servant will eat, he tells Laban and the others residing in the mother's house of his errand. He has come to find a wife for Abraham's son Isaac, and one of the key details he shares with this group of relatives is that since traveling to the land of Canaan, Abraham has become great. Great in flocks, herds, silver, gold, men servants, maid servants, camels, and asses. In other words, he makes it clear that the marriage offer he's putting on the table, so to speak, is a very attractive one. Immediately after accepting the marriage proposal, the servant bestows wedding gifts on Rebekah, her brother Laban, and her mother. As Rebekah and the servant prepare to leave the mother's house, Laban and Rebekah's mother pronounce a blessing on her that again shows the hopes that ancient Israelites attached to a marriage. Genesis 24 wastes no time describing the journey back and forth from the land of Canaan. So we immediately fast forward to Rebekah's arrival at the desert village called Be'er Lahai-Roi, where Isaac, for the first time, emerges in this story. He greets his bride, and then we read that Isaac brought her into his mother's tent and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So let's take a step back a minute and summarize some of the key aspects of this marriage. The bride and groom come from the same extended family. The marriage is negotiated through the families, with Isaac's father and Rebekah's mother and brother playing important roles. Rebekah leaves her mother's house and goes to dwell with her new husband. The marriage negotiations include economic transactions, as gold, silver, vessels, and garments are bestowed on the bride and her family. One of the key hopes tied to this marriage is fertility, expressed with a bit of hyperbole in the blessing wish of 10,000 sons. Let's turn to the second of our three weddings, the marriage of Hagar and Abram in Genesis chapter 16. We've mentioned several times the importance of children to the subsistence economy of ancient Israel. At this point in the story, Sarah and Abraham are called by their original names, Sarai and Abram. We read in Genesis 16:1, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, 'See now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children through her.'" Right away, there are several details that distinguish this type of marriage from the type we just saw negotiated for Isaac and Rebekah. First, it will be Abram's second marriage, a plural marriage, and it is entered into for the express purpose of obtaining children, because the first wife had not been able to bear children. It's not endogamous, because Hagar is Egyptian, and perhaps most significantly, it is negotiated not by Hagar's family for her benefit, but by Hagar's mistress, Sarai, for Sarai's benefit. Abram listens to Sarai and takes Hagar as a wife. The word for wife here is the exact same word used to describe Sarai as Abram's wife and Rebekah as Isaac's wife. In Hebrew, the word Isha covers all of these wives. It is only through the circumstances of marriage that we learn that Hagar is a different kind of wife who will have a different status from Sarai in Abram's household. Unlike Sarai, Hagar immediately conceives, and then we read she looked with contempt on her mistress. Sarai feels betrayed by the slave girl and by Abram, but when she complains, Abram lets her know that she is the one in control of this aspect of the household. He says, "Look, your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." What this means is that even after Hagar has become the wife, the Isha of Abram, she remains the slave girl of Sarai, and in that position, Sarai controls her destiny. We then read that Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, and Hagar fled the house into the wilderness. Again, we need to step back from the story for a minute in order to see how this marriage differs from that of Isaac and Rebekah. The first difference is that Hagar's family is not involved in the marriage negotiations, and therefore Hagar's interests are not protected. Instead, Hagar enters Abram's household as Sarai's slave girl. Sarai negotiates her change in status to wife, and she does this so that she, not Hagar, could be built up in Abram's household. No gifts are exchanged. No celebratory meal marks the occasion. Even after Hagar conceives, she remains a foreign slave under the power of Sarai. Later, in Genesis 21, Sarai, who is now Sarah, miraculously conceives and bears her own son, Isaac. And as soon as she weans Isaac, she expels Hagar and her son Ishmael from Abraham's household. Hagar has no rights to Abraham's estate. In Deuteronomy 21, verse 15, there's a law which seems designed to deal with just this kind of family dispute. If a man has two wives, the one loved, the other disliked, and they have borne him children, both the loved and the disliked, and if the firstborn son is hers that is disliked, then on the day when he assigns his possessions as an inheritance to his sons, he may not treat the son of the loved as the firstborn in preference to the son of the disliked, who is the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the disliked, giving him a double portion of all that he has. So we learn from this story that there is a second type of marriage, a marriage negotiated by a wife and a husband concerning the wife's slave girl. This second type of marriage is entered into for the purpose of securing an heir or additional heirs for the husband and his primary wife. Now let's turn to the third wedding type, marriage through abduction.
Okay, so we are not going to look at that third marriage type. If you want to look at that for yourself, it's the story of Dinah. It is triggering, so we are not going to listen to that or watch that here, but we're going to move on to the funeral aspect.
Looking at these three types of weddings attested to in the Bible, we can draw several conclusions about the lives of women in ancient Israel. First, in order for a wife to have some degree of power in her husband's household, she needs to have entered that household through a proper set of family negotiations. A woman's brothers were especially important in securing her place of prestige in her husband's household. In order to be fully secure in her husband's household, a wife had to produce an heir. If she could not, she could arrange for a secondary wife for her husband, through which she could obtain an heir. Foreign slave women and captive women were more vulnerable because they had no family to secure their rights. A wife's status in the household of her husband also affected the status of her sons. The law designed to protect the son of the hated wife speaks to a reality where the sons of hated wives were often disinherited. Finally, we'll close quite fittingly with a funeral, the funeral of Abraham, described in Genesis chapter 25. In 25 verse 7, we see that Abraham died at the age of 175 years, what the Bible describes quite appropriately as an old man, full of years. Abraham is then buried in the cave that he had purchased in order to bury his primary wife, Sarah. In other words, he is buried with his wife, Sarah. Isaac and Ishmael, his two sons from Sarah and Hagar, together bury him. But the listing of Isaac before Ishmael is significant. It's also important to note that the death and burial place of Hagar, who was banished from Abraham's home, is never recorded. Before Abraham dies, he settles his estate with his sons. And first, we learn of yet another type of marriage. After Sarah's death, Abraham arranges a third marriage for himself with a woman named Keturah. Keturah bears Abraham 6 additional sons. This makes the division of the estate a bit messy. But the story is very direct in showing that Isaac, the son of the ideal type of wife, the son of Sarah, will be the sole inheritor of Abraham's estate. So we read in Genesis 25, 5 through 6, Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts. This is actually the first time that Hagar and Keturah are not called wives with the Hebrew Isha. Instead, they are labeled concubines. This label clarifies the women and their offspring as having a lesser status than Sarah and Isaac. The story also notes that before he died, Abraham sent Ishmael and his sons, the sons of Keturah, away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. So this story of Abraham's death and burial makes it very clear that Abraham's land and wealth are tied through marriage to Sarah and her offspring. Only Sarah will merit burial in the family cave with her husband Abraham, and only Isaac will inherit the land of his father. We've learned that the type of marriage that a bride had negotiated on her behalf determined her status in her husband's household and the status of her children at the time of the patriarch's death. If she was of the same clan as her husband, and if her marriage was negotiated between the two families with gifts exchanged, meals shared, this meant her interests would be protected in the household of her husband. If she was of a different clan or nationality and she entered the house as a slave or a captive, her status would be much lower and she would not have rights to her husband's estate. Marriages were social and economic transactions that impacted a family for generations. In our next lecture, we'll examine the political structures of the village and tribe that are attested to in the book of Judges. And we'll see in the story of several judges how the status of one's mother affects the political aspirations of her son.
Y'all, I don't know. I couldn't have been back in those days. I mean, they had plural marriages. Okay, so the men have plural marriages and you're marrying your family members. I don't like my cousins like that. I don't like them like that. And then you got concubines and top tier wives and second tier wives and slave wives that are still slaves even though they're wives with kids. The flip side is that they did have to populate. So I guess that was part of populating. Anyway, I hope that you guys had a great time in tonight's class. I did. I learned a lot about the economy of Israel and what it may have looked like, the marriage structures, the family structures. Again, if you want to check out that story that we did not view, it's the story of Dinah. Please feel free to check that out. We just didn't want to play that here. I hope you guys had a good night. I'll see you in another 2 weeks.